The king said to me, "What is it you want?" Then I prayed to the God of heaven, and I answered the king, "If it pleases the king, and if your servant has found favor in his sight, let him send me to the city in Judah, where my ancestors are buried, so that I can rebuild it." Then the king, with the queen sitting beside him, asked me, "How long will your journey take, and when will you get back?" It pleased the king to send me, so I set a time. I also said to him, "If it pleases the king, may I have letters to the governors of Trans-Euphrates, so that they will provide me safe conduct until I arrive in Judah? And may I have a letter to Asaph, keeper of the royal park, so he will give me timber to make beams for the gates of the citadel by the temple and for the city wall and for the residence I will occupy? And because the gracious hand of my God was on me, the king granted my request. So I went to the governors of Trans-Euphrates and gave them the king's letters. The king had also sent army officers and cavalry with me. When Sanballat and Horonite and Tobiah, the Ammonite official, heard about this, they were very much disturbed that someone had come to promote the welfare of the Israelites. And that's not the whole story by far, but that's where I'll stop for tonight. And I encourage, again, all of you to go back and spend some time in Nehemiah. There's so much we can glean and so much we can learn and apply: how to lead, how to follow, how to listen, how to take instruction, and how to work together. They're all great examples in the book. Nehemiah himself, though, was a leader. Although he was occupied here as a servant, as a cupbearer, he was a natural leader. He was responsible and responsive to be led, and was responsive to being an example for all of us, even now. When Nehemiah got bad news, he didn't put on a front. He didn't put on a fake facade. He didn't pretend. He cried. But more importantly, he prayed and repented and asked God for mercy. In this moment, with this is where his new journey and his task started, one of rebuilding and a task of restoration, rebuilding the things and restoring the people. But why had God allowed this destruction? This is the question we always want to ask. Why did God do this? But why had the Jews been disobedient to God? Maybe that's a better question. And I charge all of us, that's the question, that the question maybe isn't for God, it's for us. That's the real question. Why did we not do what God laid out for us to do? That's what we ought to be asking ourselves, rather than asking God why he's doing this to us. And as we see Nehemiah, when we read and explore these verses, you see a great example of what's required to lead: a sense of mission, an appropriate and right leverage of power, the ability to do research and assess dutifully what's ahead of you in the work that you have, building community and solidarity as you lead. How do you manage through adversity? Refusing to embrace underhandedness, knowing when to stay in your lane and pay attention to what God gave you to do, but also being responsible to the task and to the people, not just the work, but also to the people who are under your leadership. Those are just a few examples, the ones that stuck out and were significant to me. Nehemiah knew what he embraced, and he implemented strong principles of leadership. And if you're in a position of, or you have the opportunity to lead, guys, please, thank you. I encourage you to start here for inspiration. If you're in a position of leadership, go back and look at Nehemiah, because whether it's Bible study or baseball, there's a lesson of leadership here for you. See, Nehemiah cared about others, and we saw that in the first chapter, in the first verse. He said, "When I heard these things, I sat down and wept. For some days I mourned and fasted and prayed before the God of heaven." You don't cry for things that you don't care about. If you're crying for something, it seriously means that you care. It clearly bothered him, because we read that what he was feeling on the inside, he was projecting on the outside. Nehemiah remembered what Jerusalem was and what God had promised. And you see in verse 3, and we read, "Those who survived the exile are now back in the province are in great trouble and disgrace. The wall of Jerusalem is broken down and its gates have been burned with fire." The people were in bad shape, and the place was in a bad shape too. Then we get to see what kind of man we're dealing with Nehemiah. After being in exile and being given a job of seeing if the king's food was fit to eat, a royal court job, a highly visible and respected job, Nehemiah first went to God. Nehemiah, in his response, started at his source. He started with prayer, with remorse, with confession, and with repentance. As you look at verse 5 and 6, it says, Lord, the God of heaven, the great and awesome God, let your ear be attentive and your eyes be open to hear the prayer. Your servant is praying. He was petitioning God to hear him. He knew God. He knew God's law. And Nehemiah also knew that they were outside of the covenant, and was at a point where he not only acknowledged this to God, but he took accountability to help drive for change. Nehemiah said, I confess the sins we, the Israelites, including myself and my father's family, have committed against you. We have acted very wickedly towards you. We have not obeyed the commands and decrees and laws. How many of us go to God and accept responsibility for yourself, not just for yourself, but also for others? How many of us go to God and pray, Lord, I'm sorry for us, not me, us? An unselfish prayer. Nehemiah acknowledged God. We screwed up. He didn't say they screwed up. He said we screwed up. That's sacrificial leadership. He stood in and did not try to isolate himself from what was going on. Nehemiah then recalls the covenant and what God had required. You can't really be sorry for something if you don't know what you're sorry for. And Nehemiah played this back in verses 7 and 10. He says, remember the instruction you gave your servant Moses? Of course, God remembers. He says, if you are unfaithful, I will scatter you. But if you return to me and obey my commands, then I will gather them from there and bring them to the place I have chosen. Nehemiah confessed to God, we didn't keep the commandments, but our sovereign God already knew this. See, if you look at what God said in verse 8 in the first chapter, it says, if we transgress. So God already knew. He already knew what was going to happen. He said, but God is giving you a way back. And then he said, yet and then giving you a path back to restoration. When we get to verse 10, I couldn't help but smile and then grimace a little and then smile again, because in verse 10, Nehemiah said to God, they are your servants and your people who you redeemed by your great strength and your mighty hand. I smiled and I grimaced because I can relate. Nehemiah here was saying, it's us, God. I know it don't look like us, but it's us. You know when you've done something wrong or you sneak up on somebody, you have to start with, wait, it's me. Don't do that. Don't do that thing. It's me. Don't you recognize me? And that's almost what Nehemiah said. He had to remind God that it's us, even though it don't look like us, because we're not doing what you told us to do. Because I imagine Nehemiah could feel in his spirit what God was looking at and thinking, this can't be my people. I'm certain of it. These ain't my people. I told y'all what to do. I left you clear and strict instruction of what to do. Who is this? Certainly no child, no family, not my people doing this. Now, take a commercial break before we get into chapter 2, because prayer is what wraps up chapter 1, and a firm ending with prayer. He started with prayer and he ended with prayer. As then we go into chapter 2, and here is where I want you to pay more close attention to the power of relationship. In chapter 1, we reestablish what's our responsibility, knowing and abiding and being responsive to the rules that God left us. But I also want you to pay very close attention to relationship and what you get from relationship. Nehemiah's relationship and the power and connection of those close relationships is what allowed and enabled him to do what he was doing and what he was about to